Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of humanity's greatest talents, coming up with increasingly creative ways to hurt each other when talking no longer works. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. I'm not here to lay siege to your village or confiscate your firewood. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Medieval warfare wasn't a noble contest of honor, bravery, and mutual respect. That idea mostly exists because centuries later, people who were not there needed something comforting to believe. In reality, medieval combat was a design problem that kept getting worse, like an arms race run by people who had never heard the phrase, "Maybe this is enough." Every battle asks the same question. How do we stop the other person from continuing to exist? Preferably before lunch. At first, swords worked fine. Then armor happened. Lots of armor. More armor every year. Knights kept adding metal plates like they were afraid the enemy might try to hug them too hard. Soon, warriors resembled walking cookware. Confident, loud, and increasingly difficult to deal with. Weapon makers responded the only way they knew how. Panic mixed with creativity. If cutting stopped working, they crushed. If crushing failed, they punctured. If puncturing didn't solve the issue, they hooked, yanked, tripped, or simply knocked the other person over and let gravity finish the conversation. Medieval engineers did not believe in elegant solutions. They believed in did it work, yes or no. And what's impressive or deeply concerning is how fast innovation happened. Someone would show up to a battlefield in thicker armor, and within a few years, everyone else would be carrying a brand new weapon specifically designed to make that armor feel like a bad financial decision. No refunds, no warranty. Blacksmiths experimented constantly. They added spikes because why not? They added chains because rigidity had failed them emotionally. They extended handles so soldiers could maintain a safe emotional distance from the screaming. Every design choice screamed, "I learned this the hard way." This creativity wasn't limited to professionals. Farmers modified tools. Hunters repurposed gear. Militia showed up holding things that technically had other jobs last week. If it could transfer force and cause regret, it was weaponized immediately. The battlefield became a testing ground for bad ideas that worked far too well, and once an idea worked, it spread quickly. There were no ethics committees, no safety testing, no let's think this through. There was only survival and the quiet hope that whatever you built would bounce back and hit you. Medieval warfare wasn't poetic, it wasn't romantic. It was iterative design under extreme stress. And every strange, terrifying weapon you're about to see is proof that when humans are cold, scared, and armored like refrigerators, creativity becomes mandatory. The flail is what happens when medieval weapon designers looked at a perfectly normal stick and thought, this is far too safe. At its core, the flail is simple. A handle, a chain, and a spiked ball attached at the end. In practice, it is uncontrolled chaos, physics with anger issues, and a complete rejection of personal safety. The logic behind the flail was actually clever. Shields were becoming a problem. Armor was getting thicker. Straight weapons bounced. So, someone asked the most medieval question imaginable. What if the weapon didn't stop when it hit something? Enter the chain. The flail could swing around shields, over armor, and occasionally into the face of the person wielding it. Innovation has risks. Unlike swords, the flail had no interest in elegance. There was no graceful fencing, no careful timing, no polite exchange of blows. You swung it, and the battlefield figured out the rest. The chain absorbed momentum, redirected force, and turned every movement into a surprise. Even experienced fighters never fully knew where the spiked head would land. This kept enemies nervous and allies extremely alert. The flail's biggest strength was psychological. Facing a flail wasn't just dangerous, it was stressful. Shields became unreliable. Armor felt less comforting. Every swing threatened to sneak around defenses like an uninvited guest who knew your schedule. The sound alone, metal rattling, chain snapping through the air, was enough to raise heart rates before contact was even made. Of course, the flail had one tiny flaw. It was just as dangerous to the user. Tight formations, bad idea. Confined spaces, worse idea, swinging too hard. Congratulations, you've discovered recoil the medieval way. Many injuries attributed to battlefield accidents were likely flail-related misunderstandings between weapon and owner. This is why flails were never universally adopted. They required space, strength, and the acceptance that sometimes the weapon simply made its own decisions. Not every soldier wanted to gamble their life on an object that behaved like it resented being held. Still, the flail represents medieval creativity perfectly. It wasn't refined, it wasn't safe, but it solved a problem. Shield stopped working quite so well. Armor became less reassuring. And chaos was introduced into an already chaotic environment. The flail wasn't designed to be perfect, it was designed to be unpredictable. And in medieval warfare, unpredictability was sometimes the deadliest feature of all. At some point in medieval history, weapon designers collectively gave up on subtlety. Swords weren't cutting it anymore. Literally, armor had become so effective that slicing attacks often resulted in nothing more than a loud clang and an awkward pause where both fighters reconsidered their life choices. And so, the mace was born, a weapon that asked a very simple question. What if we stopped trying to get through the armor and just punish the person inside it? The mace didn't care about sharp edges or elegant technique. It was blunt force trauma with confidence. A solid handle topped with a heavy, often flanged head designed to concentrate force into small areas. You didn't need to pierce armor. You just needed to hit it hard enough that the body underneath filed a formal complaint. Flanges were the real innovation. Instead of a smooth ball that spread impact evenly, flanges focused energy into narrow ridges. This meant more damage, more shock, and more regret per swing. Armor dented, bones cracked. Internal organs learned that helmets were not, in fact, soundproof. What made the mace especially appealing was its simplicity. No edge to sharpen, no blade to chip, no complicated technique required. If you could lift it and swing it, you were already qualified. Medieval armies appreciated this efficiency. Training took time, panic did not. The mace also had a deeply psychological effect. Being hit by a sword hurt, but it often came with visible wounds. Being hit by a mace that left you standing there confused, dizzy, and suddenly questioning why the world was spinning. Knights discovered that surviving a mace strike didn't mean they were fine. It just meant the damage was happening invisibly inside their very expensive armor. Clerics even favored maces, supposedly because they avoided shedding blood. This was technically true in the same way that dropping a piano on someone avoids stabbing them. The end result was still extremely final. Of course, maces had downsides. They were heavy, they required strength, and they weren't particularly inspiring to look at. No one ever gazed upon a mace and thought, yes, beauty. But medieval warfare wasn't about aesthetics. It was about efficiency. The mace represented a turning point. Armor was no longer protection, it was packaging. And the mace was the delivery method. If the mace was medieval frustration made solid, the Warhammer was frustration given a graduate degree. Weapon designers had already accepted that cutting was overrated and crushing was effective. The Warhammer simply refined the idea and added a very clear message. Your armor investment was a mistake. At first glance, the Warhammer looks almost polite, smaller than a mace, narrower, less dramatic. But this was not kindness, this was focus. One side of the head was usually a flat hammer face designed to deliver concentrated blunt force. The other side was often a sharp spike or beak meant to punch into armor, helmets, or joints like a medieval can opener. The genius of the Warhammer was its precision. You didn't need to swing wildly. You didn't need dramatic momentum. You needed accuracy. A solid strike to the helmet could scramble thoughts instantly. A blow to the shoulder could numb an entire arm. A well-placed spike could turn a knight's sense of invincibility into immediate panic. Armor wearers quickly learned a hard truth: protection did not equal safety. Plate armor distributed force, but it did not cancel it. A warhammer didn't slice through metal, it transmitted energy straight through it. The armor stayed intact, the person inside did not. This made warhammers especially popular in close combat. When battles collapsed into chaotic scrums of shouting, slipping, and very poor footing, the warhammer excelled. It was compact, fast, devastating, and unlike swords, it didn't get stuck or bounce off at the worst possible moment, despite added insult to injury. It targeted weak points, visors, armpits, joints, anywhere the armor had to bend. Knights spent years training to move in armor, only to discover that one sharp beak could undo all that effort in a second. Confidence vanished quickly after the first dented helmet. Warhammers also had a psychological advantage: they looked purposeful. This was not a weapon you accidentally carried. If someone approached you with a warhammer, you knew exactly what they intended, and none of it involved discussion. In many ways, the warhammer marked the moment medieval warfare fully embraced physics over tradition. No romance, no ceremony, just leverage, momentum, and the understanding that metal does not stop force. It merely redirects it. For armored warriors, this was a sobering realization. For warhammer designers, it was a success story. At some point, medieval soldiers collectively realized an important truth: being close to danger was optional. You didn't actually need to stand face to face with a heavily armored, angry stranger to solve the problem. You could simply keep them far away and make it their problem instead, and thus, the polearm rose to prominence. Polearms were the long-handled multi-tools of medieval warfare: spears, halberds, glaives, bills. If it had a long stick and something unpleasant attached to the end, it qualified. The design philosophy was simple: maximize reach, minimize regret. A spear alone already changed everything. Suddenly, foot soldiers could threaten knights before the knight's sword even became relevant. A line of spears turned infantry into a moving wall of absolutely naught. Horses refused to charge. Armor became irrelevant if you couldn't get close enough to use it. Distance wasn't cowardice. It was strategy with self-respect. Then things escalated. Designers began adding blades, hooks, spikes, and edges to the spearhead, turning it into something that could stab, slash, hook, and occasionally ruin a rider's entire afternoon. The halberd, for example, combined an axe blade, a spear point, and a hook because one way of causing problems clearly wasn't enough. Polearms were especially effective against knights on horseback. Horses are brave, but they are not stupid. A wall of sharp objects pointed at chest height sends a very clear message. If the horse stopped, the knight stopped. If the knight stopped, gravity took over. Gravity has always been one of medieval warfare's most reliable allies. There was also a morale advantage. Facing a single sword was intimidating. Facing a dozen polearms moving in unison was terrifying. Infantry units trained to keep formation, brace together, and advance slowly. Individual heroics mattered less than collective pressure. Medieval warfare quietly shifted from look impressive to stay alive. Of course, polearms weren't glamorous. You didn't duel with them, you didn't pose heroically. You stood in line, held your ground, and trusted your neighbors not to panic. It was less romantic and far more effective. In many ways, polearms represented maturity in medieval warfare. Less flair, more practicality, more understanding that distance reduces risk. Polearms didn't promise glory, they promised survival. And in medieval combat, that was the most creative weapon of all. The Bec de Corbin is proof that medieval weapon designers were not done experimenting. They had simply grown more specific. If the warhammer made armor uncomfortable, the Bec de Corbin made it personal. This was not a general-purpose weapon. This was a targeted complaint delivered at high speed. At first glance, The Bec de Corbin looks like a Warhammer that decided to specialize. One side featured a hammer face for crushing armor. The other side ended in a long curved spike, the crow's beak, designed to puncture, hook, and generally ruin the structural integrity of anything wearing expensive metal. The brilliance of the Bec de Corbin was versatility. You could smash with it, you could puncture with it, and if neither worked immediately, you could hook your opponent and introduce them to the ground, which medieval warfare considered a perfectly acceptable finishing move. Knights spent years learning how to stay mounted, balanced, and dignified, only to be yanked off their horse like a sack of grain. Armor joints were the real targets: elbows, knees, visors, armpits, all the places armor had to bend to remain functional. The crow's beak slipped into these gaps with disturbing ease. Suddenly, all that steel protection turned into a very expensive trap you were stuck inside. The Bec de Corbin also excelled at intimidation. There is something deeply unsettling about being approached by someone holding a long pole topped with a hammer on one side and a curved spike on the other. It looked less like a weapon and more like a medieval instructional tool titled "How This Ends," and unlike swords, the Bec de Corbin didn't require elegance. It required intent. You didn't fence with it. You advanced, selected a target, and applied force until the situation resolved itself. Training mattered, but enthusiasm mattered more. This weapon thrived in the later medieval period when plate armor reached its peak. Knights were well protected, confident, and increasingly frustrated that people kept inventing tools specifically designed to negate that protection. The Bec de Corbin was the embodiment of that frustration. In many ways, it marked the moment medieval warfare stopped pretending armor was invincible. It wasn't about breaking the armor, it was about exploiting it. The Bec de Corbin didn't argue with armor. It negotiated with leverage, and it usually won. If medieval weapons had a most controversial category, the crossbow would win it without competition, not because it was especially flashy or elegant or honorable, but because it worked a little too well, and it worked for the wrong people. Up until the crossbow became widespread, killing a fully armored knight required years of training, physical strength, and an unfortunate amount of bravery. Knights liked this system. It justified their social status, their expensive equipment, and their belief that they were naturally superior at violence. The crossbow arrived and quietly ruined all of that. The problem with the crossbow was simple. It removed skill from the equation. A peasant with minimal training could pick one up, aim it roughly in the correct direction, and deliver a bolt with enough force to punch through armor, mail, or expose joints. Generations of martial tradition undone by a mechanical trigger and bad intentions. This deeply upset the ruling classes. Crossbows were powerful because they stored energy mechanically. You didn't need great strength. The bowstring was drawn using levers, cranks, or windlasses. Once loaded, the weapon waited patiently like it was holding a grudge. When released, all that stored energy went straight into the bolt and then directly into someone's day. They were accurate, they were deadly, and they were terrifying. Knights described crossbows as cowardly weapons, which is medieval language, for this is extremely inconvenient for me personally. The church even attempted to ban them for use against Christians, declaring them unfit for honorable warfare. This declaration was immediately ignored by everyone who wanted to survive. On the battlefield, crossbows changed behavior. Knights avoided open ground. Shields grew larger, armor designs shifted. Pavis shields, large portable walls, appeared specifically so crossbowmen could reload without becoming targets themselves. Warfare adapted around the weapon because it could not be ignored, and the psychological impact was enormous. You didn't see a crossbow bolt coming. You didn't hear a warning. One moment you were confident in your armor. The next you were on the ground wondering when everything went sideways. Crossbows weren't creative in shape. They were creative in consequence. They flattened social hierarchies and made medieval warfare less about lineage and more about positioning, patience, and luck. The crossbow didn't care who you were. It didn't care what you wore. It cared only about whether you were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that made it one of the most feared weapons of the medieval world. Not every medieval weapon needed to be large, loud, or impressive. Some of the most effective designs were tiny, quiet, and powered entirely by spite. Enter the cowrip, a small spiked object designed with one simple promise. No matter how it lands, one spike will always point upward, waiting patiently to ruin someone's day. Cowrops were medieval minimalism at its finest. No moving parts, no training required, no honor involved. You didn't swing them, aim them, or duel with them. You simply scattered them on the ground and let physics and poor footwear handle the rest. It was weaponized inconvenience taken to its logical extreme. The real victims of cowrops weren't just soldiers. They were horses, and medieval armies lived and died by their horses. A single cowrop under a hoof could an animal instantly, turning a powerful cavalry charge into a confused, screaming mess of stopped momentum and shattered confidence. Knights might survive injuries. Horses rarely did. For infantry, cowrips were psychological warfare. You couldn't see them easily, you couldn't hear them. And once you knew they were present, every step became a negotiation. Marching slowed, formations broke, panic crept in, all because of a handful of metal objects small enough to fit in a pouch. What made cowrops especially cruel was their efficiency. They were cheap to produce, easy to transport, and reusable if you were brave enough to retrieve them afterward. Armies could deny entire areas to enemy movement without lifting a sword. Roads, fields, choke points, all became hazards simply because someone had scattered tiny spikes and walked away smiling. Cowrops also ignored armor entirely. Plate protection meant nothing if you couldn't walk. Shields were useless. Skill didn't matter. Rank didn't matter. Everyone had feet. Everyone needed them. Medieval designers understood this deeply and leaned into it without hesitation. There was no romance in cowrops, no dramatic charge, no heroic clash, just a sudden, sharp realization that the ground itself had turned against you. Many battles were delayed, redirected, or abandoned simply because advancing safely was no longer possible. In a strange way, cowrops represent medieval warfare at its most honest. No speeches, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the best way to win is to make movement impossible. Cowrips didn't kill you directly, they just made sure you couldn't run when everything else tried to. And in medieval warfare, that was often worse. If the mace was medieval blunt force trauma in its purest form, the Morning Star was that same idea, after someone said. But what if we added spikes for emphasis? The result was a weapon that took everything uncomfortable about being hit with a mace and made it emotionally discouraging as well. At first glance, the Morning Star looks almost decorative. A metal ball covered in spikes attached to a handle like some sort of violent ornament. This is misleading. The spikes were not for style. They were there to ensure that even armor that survived the initial impact still had regrets afterward. The logic was brutally simple. A smooth mace head distributed force evenly, which was great for crushing bones, but occasionally allowed armor to do its job too well. The Morning Star corrected this by concentrating impact into smaller, angrier points. Instead of spreading the force, it focused it. Armor dented deeper, padding compressed harder. Whatever was underneath learned an important lesson about consequences. Morning Stars also had a psychological edge. Spikes do something to the human brain. A plain metal ball says, "This will hurt." A spiked one says, "This will hurt," and I enjoyed designing it. Facing a Morning Star was unsettling in a way that went beyond physics. It looked personal. Unlike flails, most Morning Stars were rigid. No chain, no chaos, no surprise recoil. This made them safer for the user and more predictable in formation fighting. You could swing with confidence, knowing the weapon was going to come back and demand an apology afterward. They were also durable. No delicate edges, no sharpening, no maintenance beyond. Is it still heavy and covered in spikes? If yes, you are good to go. Medieval armies appreciated weapons that survived abuse, weather, and occasional misuse by people who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Morning stars found their place, especially in close combat, where space was limited and panic was plentiful. A single swing could knock an opponent off balance, crack armor, and instantly drain morale. Even if the enemy survived, they rarely wanted to continue the conversation. In many ways, the morning star represented medieval escalation. Maces worked, so someone asked how to make them worse. The answer was spikes, always spikes. The morning star wasn't subtle, it wasn't elegant. It was a reminder that medieval creativity often followed one rule: if it works, add spikes and try again. If handheld weapons were medieval creativity on a personal level, siege weapons were creativity scaled up until it required math, teamwork, and a worrying lack of empathy. At some point, medieval armies looked at fortified cities, thick walls, tall towers, smug defenders, and decided the solution was to throw buildings at buildings. Enter siege engines, trebuchets, mongonals, and ballista weren't just weapons. They were statements. They said, "We don't want to fight you. We want your wall to stop existing." And if that wall happened to be attached to a city, that was simply collateral inconvenience. The trebuchet was the star of the show, powered by gravity and an unholy amount of patience. It could hurl massive stones over long distances with terrifying accuracy. Watching one operate was like witnessing physics lose its temper. Crews carefully adjusted angles, counterweights, and release points. Also, a single rock could fly through the air and politely remove a section of masonry. But stones were only the beginning. Medieval armies quickly realized that fear traveled farther than rocks. So they launched burning materials, diseased animal carcasses, and occasionally very loud messages in the form of whatever was lying around. Nothing says please surrender like a decomposing cow landing in your courtyard. Ballast, essentially oversized crossbows, delivered bolts the size of tree trunks. These weren't meant for precision duels. They were meant to punch through gates, towers, and morale simultaneously. Mongonals hurled stones with less finesse, but more enthusiasm, proving that accuracy was optional when momentum was impressive enough. Siege weapons changed warfare by shifting combat from personal bravery to industrial persistence. You didn't win by skill alone, you won by outlasting, outthinking, and outbuilding your enemy. Sieges could last weeks or months, grinding down defenders psychologically, long before walls actually fell. And here's the truly creative part: most siege engines were built on site. Armies showed up with tools, timber, and instructions, then constructed enormous weapons within sight of the people they planned to use them on. Imagine watching your enemy assemble a machine specifically designed to destroy your home. That's medieval confidence. Siege warfare wasn't elegant. It was slow, brutal, and deeply uncomfortable. But it worked. Walls cracked, cities surrendered. And medieval engineers proved that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't something you held in your hands. It was something that reshaped the battlefield entirely. Siege weapons didn't just attack defenses, they attacked hope. After centuries of inventing increasingly creative ways to kill each other, medieval soldiers finally paused and asked a rare, thoughtful question. What if we didn't die right away? The answer was the Pavis shield, a piece of equipment that marks the moment medieval warfare briefly flirted with self-preservation. The Pavisy wasn't a shield in the heroic sense. You didn't charge with it, you didn't duel with it, you didn't look impressive holding it. It was large, rectangular, and about as elegant as a wooden door ripped off its hinges. But it worked, and that made it beautiful in a very practical medieval way. Designed primarily for crossbowmen, the Pavis was essentially a portable wall. Soldiers planted it into the ground, crouched behind it, and used it as cover while reloading. A process that took long enough for an enemy archer to finish a prayer, lose a shot, and reconsider their career. Without cover, reloading was a gamble. With a Pavis, it became survivable. These shields were often tall enough to protect the entire body and sometimes curved slightly to deflect incoming missiles. Many were painted with symbols, city crests, or religious imagery because nothing says, "Please protect me," like a saint watching over your reload cycle. The Pavis changed battlefield behavior. Crossbow units became more disciplined, more stationary, and more lethal. Instead of firing once and running, they could hold ground, reload safely, and keep pressure on advancing enemies. This frustrated knights immensely, which in medieval warfare was often the goal. Of course, the Pavis came with downsides. It was heavy, awkward, and absolutely not something you wanted to carry uphill while arrows were flying. Soldiers assigned to carry Pavises were basically medieval interns. Vital, underappreciated, and constantly wondering how their life choices led here. Still, the Pavis represents an important shift. Medieval warfare began to acknowledge that survival mattered. Protection wasn't just armor anymore. It was positioning, teamwork, and the willingness to hide behind a very large piece of wood. The Pav wasn't flashy, it didn't inspire songs. But it saved lives, which in medieval warfare was revolutionary. Once medieval warfare discovered fire, things escalated quickly. Fire didn't care about armor, rank, training, or confidence. Fire simply arrived and announced that everyone's plans were cancelled. It was the most democratic weapon medieval armies ever used, and they loved it for that reason. Fire weapons came in many forms: flaming arrows, burning pitch, pots of oil set alight and hurled over walls. If it could burn and could be thrown, medieval armies tried it at least once, sometimes twice, just to be sure. The goal wasn't always destruction, often it was panic, and fire was very good at that. Flaming arrows were less about accuracy and more about chaos. One arrow landing on a thatched roof could turn a quiet town into a screaming maze of smoke and confusion. Suddenly, defenders weren't guarding walls. They were desperately trying to stop their own homes from disappearing behind them. Fire didn't need to kill you directly. It just needed to make you abandon your position. Burning pitch was worse. Thick, sticky, and stubbornly committed to staying on fire. Pitch clung to wood, walls, and anything unfortunate enough to be nearby. Once ignited, it refused to be put out easily. Water laughed at it. Sand helped sometimes. Panic did nothing except make it spread faster. Then there was Greek fire, the stuff of legend, a mysterious incendiary weapon that burned even on water, terrified enemies, and ensured that nobody who faced it ever forgot the experience. Exact formulas were closely guarded, which is medieval, for no one wanted this used on them. Later, fire weapons worked best psychologically. Flames lit up the night, smoke choked the air. The sound alone, crackling, roaring, collapsing structures drained morale faster than any blade. Soldiers broke ranks, commanders lost control. Orders vanished in the noise. Fire also turned sieges into nightmares. Cities depended on wooden structures, food stores, and morale. A well-placed fire could undo months of preparation in minutes. Even if the fire was contained, the fear lingered. Defenders slept lightly, watching shadows flicker and wondering when the next flame would appear. Medieval warfare loved fire because it solved problems quickly. It didn't need precision. It didn't need bravery. It just needed opportunity and a strong wind. Fire didn't argue. Fire didn't negotiate. Fire reminded everyone that sometimes the most creative weapon, the one that removes all other options. Not every medieval battle was fought with beautifully crafted weapons forged by master blacksmiths. In fact, many battles were fought with whatever happened to be within arm's reach at the exact moment things went terribly wrong. This is where improvised weapons entered the chat. Uninvited, unregulated, and extremely enthusiastic, medieval warfare rarely followed the plan. Formations broke, weapons snapped, people tripped, horses panicked, and suddenly the battlefield became a chaotic flea market of sharp objects, heavy objects, and objects that had no business being involved in combat. but absolutely were now. Broken spears became clubs. Sword hilts became punching tools. Shields were used less for blocking and more for aggressively introducing someone to the ground. Rocks were picked up and thrown with impressive emotional commitment. Helmets were grabbed by the rim and used as handles. If you could lift it, swing it, or drop it from above, congratulations, you had a weapon. Farm tools were especially popular because medieval armies were often made up of farmers who had already spent years mastering these objects. Axes, scythes, pitchforks, flails that were originally for grain all transitioned into combat roles with minimal adjustment. The only real difference was intent. One moment you're harvesting crops, the next you're harvesting enemies. Medieval life moved fast. Improvised weapons were brutally effective because they were unexpected. Armor was designed to stop known threats. Swords, spears, arrows. It was far less prepared for being beaten with a wagon wheel or stabbed with a sharpened fence post. Chaos favors the adaptable, and improvisation thrived in chaos. There was also a psychological factor. Facing a trained knight with a polished weapon was intimidating. Facing an exhausted peasant swinging a random object with nothing left to lose was deeply unsettling. That person was not following rules. That person was not concerned with survival statistics. That person was a problem. Improvised weapons remind us that medieval warfare wasn't just about equipment. It was about mindset. When structure collapsed, creativity filled the gap. No manuals, no permission, just raw survival instinct turned into action. In many battles, the most dangerous moment wasn't the charge or the clash. It was the aftermath when order disappeared and everyone started solving problems on the fly. Improvised weapons weren't elegant, they weren't planned, but they worked. And that made them just as medieval as anything forged in steel. For all the steel, spikes, fire, and clever engineering, medieval warfare ran on one invisible fuel more powerful than any weapon: fear. Most medieval weapons weren't designed just to kill. They were designed to terrify. If you could break the enemy's nerve, the battle ended faster, cheaper, and with far less effort. Medieval commanders understood this deeply, even if they never phrased it so politely. Consider the sheer visual chaos of a medieval battlefield. Clinking armor, shouting men, horses screaming like they had just realized what was happening. Weapons covered in spikes, chains rattling, banners flapping dramatically for absolutely no practical reason. Everything about the scene was engineered to overwhelm the senses. Fear wasn't accidental, it was curated. Many weapons were shaped specifically to look unsettling. Spikes served no purpose once someone was already dead, but they were excellent at making people reconsider advancing. Chains made noise. Noise meant panic. Fire lit up the night sky, turning darkness into a flickering nightmare. Siege engines loomed in the distance, silently promising that walls, homes, and hope were temporary concepts. Even sound itself became a weapon. Drums beat rhythms meant to unsettle. Horns blared unpredictably. The roar of a charging army wasn't just noise. It was psychological pressure applied in waves. Your body reacted before your brain had time to argue. Fear also spread faster than facts. One unit breaking ranks could trigger a collapse across an entire army. You didn't need to kill everyone. You just needed to convince them they were already losing. Medieval weapons that looked brutal helped accelerate that process. If someone nearby fell screaming after encountering a flail, morning star, or burning pitch, everyone else paid attention. Armor didn't stop fear. Training didn't stop fear. Experience sometimes made it worse because veterans knew exactly what those weapons could do. Confidence shattered quickly when imagination filled in the blanks. Even after battles ended, fear lingered. Survivors carried memories, scars, and stories back home. Tales of horrifying weapons spread faster than armies ever could, ensuring that future opponents arrived already nervous. In medieval warfare, killing was often secondary. Winning meant control. Control came from breaking morale, and morale broke when fear took hold. Steel cut bodies. Fire destroyed structures, but fear dismantled armies from the inside. And medieval weapon designers, whether they admitted it or not, knew exactly what they were doing. When you strip away the armor, the banners, the spikes, and the unsettling enthusiasm for fire, medieval weapons all share one origin: survival. Not glory, not cruelty for its own sake. Survival in a world where losing meant death, poverty, or watching everything you owned burn behind a stone wall. Medieval weapon creativity wasn't driven by imagination in the artistic sense. It was driven by necessity. Armor improved, so weapons adapted. Walls rose higher, so stones flew farther. Shields blocked blades, so chains wrapped around them. Every invention was a reaction, not a fantasy. Someone encountered a problem, survived it just barely, and then went home thinking that cannot happen again. And so the cycle continued. What makes medieval weapons so fascinating is just how brutal they were. It's how practical they were. There was no wasted effort, no decorative excess without purpose. Every spike, hook, flange, and awkward angle existed because it solved a specific problem someone had faced in combat. Medieval engineers weren't trying to impress future museum visitors. They were trying to make sure tomorrow still existed. There's also something deeply human about this creativity. When resources were limited, people used what they had. Farm tools became weapons. Construction techniques became siege engines. Physics became a trusted ally. Even fear itself was harnessed and weaponized because humans understood that breaking morale was often easier than breaking bodies. And despite the brutality, there was intelligence here: strategy, observation, iteration. Medieval warfare was a harsh classroom, and its students learned quickly. Every failure became data. Every survival became proof of concept. It's tempting to view medieval weapons as crude or barbaric compared to modern technology, but in reality, they were incredibly sophisticated responses to the conditions of their time. They were built by people who understood materials, force, leverage, and human psychology long before those concepts had tidy scientific names. Creative medieval weapons weren't about cruelty. They were about adaptation, about refusing to be helpless, about solving problems with the tools available, no matter how uncomfortable the solution looked. In the end, medieval warfare wasn't defined by swords or spikes. It was defined by ingenuity under pressure, and that more than anything is what made these weapons truly medieval. Theodora was born around the year 500 in Constantinople, not into marble halls or silk-draped chambers, but into the unstable, loud, and unforgiving margins of Byzantine society. Her father worked as a bearer for the Hippodromium, the vast arena where chariot racing, factional violence, and imperial politics collided. It was a dangerous job, poorly paid, and utterly dependent on public favor. When he died while Theodora was still a child, her family fell immediately into hardship. In Byzantium, status was inherited, and without a male protector, a family could vanish socially almost overnight. From an early age, Theodora learned that survival depended on adaptability. There was no illusion of innocence in her upbringing. The city around her was magnificent and cruel in equal measure, and it rewarded cleverness far more than virtue. As a teenager, she entered the world of the stage. Officially, she was an actress performing comedic and dramatic roles for public audiences. In reality, Byzantine moral codes treated actresses as morally suspect at best and openly dishonorable at worst. Law and custom grouped them with prostitutes, denying them respectability, legal protection, and any chance of marrying into the elite. Yet, the stage gave Theodora something most women of her background never possessed: an audience. Performing before crowds taught her how to command attention, how to read emotion, and how to manipulate expectation. She learned when to provoke laughter, when to provoke discomfort, and when to hold silence just long enough to dominate a room. These were not theatrical tricks alone, they were political skills in their earliest form. Contemporary sources hostile to Theodora later exaggerated her performances into scandal, portraying her youth as depraved and immoral. What matters more than the gossip is the reality beneath it. She lived in a society that left women of her class with few choices. Theodora did not collapse under that pressure. She observed it, learned from it, and endured it. By the time she left Constantinople in early adulthood, traveling through the eastern provinces of the empire, she was no longer merely a performer. She was a woman hardened by poverty, trained in persuasion, and acutely aware of how power truly functioned. Long before she ever wore a crown, Theodora understood crowds, fear, and authority. Those lessons learned at the bottom of society would later shape the fate of an empire. After leaving Constantinople, Theodora disappeared from the capital's brutal spotlight and entered a period of wandering that would quietly reshape her life. She traveled east across the Byzantine world, eventually reaching North Africa, where she lived for several years, far from the hippodromium crowds and their easy cruelty. This was not a triumphant exile. It was a retreat forced by exhaustion, disillusionment, and the limits of survival through performance alone. For the first time, Theodora lived without an audience. In these provinces, she encountered communities very different from the glittering cynicism of the capital. Here, religious debate mattered deeply, especially the growing divide within Christianity. Theodora became closely associated with Monophysite believers, a theological movement considered heretical by the imperial establishment, but deeply rooted among the poor and marginalized. This was not merely a spiritual shift, it was political education. Theodora saw firsthand how doctrine could divide populations, justify persecution, and create loyalty stronger than blood or law. During this period, she adopted a life of austerity. Sources describe her living modestly, supporting herself through textile work rather than performance. Whether fully accurate or shaped by later admiration, the transformation is clear. Theodora was no longer defined by spectacle, she was reshaping her identity. Poverty no longer humiliated her, it disciplined her. When she eventually returned to Constantinople, she was not the same woman who had left. Gone was the reckless performer defined by public scandal. In her place stood someone controlled, observant, and intensely serious. She understood suffering now not as an abstraction, but as lived reality. That understanding would later shape her sympathy toward women, the poor, and religious minorities. It was around this time that she crossed paths with Justinian, then a rising political figure and nephew of the reigning emperor. Their meeting was not destiny wrapped in romance, it was strategic convergence. Justinian saw intelligence, charisma, and resolve beneath Theodora's controversial past. She saw ambition backed by proximity to power. Both recognized the other as useful, dangerous, and rare. Their relationship faced immediate resistance. Law forbade high-ranking officials from marrying actresses. Rather than abandon her, Justinian changed the law itself. This was the first sign of Theodora's influence. Even before she wore the imperial crown, her life had already proven one thing beyond doubt. She could not be erased, silenced, or contained. She had learned to survive obscurity, and now she was ready to return to the center of power on her own terms. When Justinian ascended the throne in the year 527, Theodora rose with him, not as a decorative consort, but as a ruling partner. From the moment she was crowned Augusta, it was clear that this was not a traditional imperial marriage. Theodora did not remain behind palace walls, content with ceremony and titles. She attended councils, received foreign envoys, and involved herself directly in matters of law, religion, and security. For many in the Byzantine elite, her presence was unsettling. An empress with a voice was one thing. An empress who expected to be obeyed was another. Her background made her uniquely suited to power. Unlike aristocrats raised in comfort, Theodora understood fear, hunger, and public humiliation. She knew how quickly crowds could turn violent, and how easily authority could collapse if it appeared weak. This realism shaped her political instincts. She favored decisive action over compromise and loyalty over tradition. Those who underestimated her did so briefly. Theodora quickly became a protector of marginalized groups, especially women. She pushed for laws that punished sexual exploitation, expanded property rights for women, and allowed former prostitutes legal protection and the chance at a new life. These reforms were not abstract morality, they were personal. Theodora legislated from memory, reshaping law to prevent others from enduring what she once had. Her religious influence was equally significant. Though officially aligned with imperial orthodoxy, she quietly supported Monophysite Christians, sheltering their leaders within the palace and using imperial authority to moderate persecution. This balancing act required extraordinary political finesse. Theodora managed to defend theological minorities without openly challenging imperial doctrine, proving she understood power not as blunt force, but as pressure applied at the right moment. Court historians later struggled to categorize her. Some portrayed her as ruthless, others as saintly. Both missed the point. Theodora was pragmatic. She believed the empire survived through strength, discipline, and calculated mercy, not nostalgia for tradition. She had no patience for elites who confused lineage with competence. By the early years of Justinian's reign, it was already clear that the empire was ruled by two minds, not one. Theodora was not an exception to Byzantine politics. She was its evolution. Her authority did not come from birth or military command, but from an unshakable understanding of human behavior that made her dangerous and indispensable. In the year 532, Constantinople erupted into chaos. What began as factional violence between rival chariot teams exploded into full-scale rebellion. The city burned as mobs seized streets, murdered officials, and declared a rival emperor. This was the Nar Revolt, the most dangerous uprising of Justinian's reign. And for several days, it appeared that his rule and his life were finished. As flames consumed palaces and churches, panic spread through the imperial court. Advisors urged Justinian to flee across the Bosphorus, abandon the capital, and regroup elsewhere. Escape ships were prepared. Survival, they argued, was preferable to martyrdom. In that moment of fear, authority wavered. The empire teetered on the edge of collapse. It was Theodora who refused to yield. According to later accounts, she stood before the council and delivered words that became legend. Royalty, she said, was a noble burial shroud. To flee was to live in shame. To die as an empress was preferable to survival without power. This was not rhetoric born of pride. It was political clarity. Theodora understood something her panicked advisors did not. Once an emperor runs, he ceases to be emperor. Retreat would not save Justinian, it would end him. Her resolve forced a decision. Justinian stayed. What followed was brutal and decisive. Imperial forces sealed the hippodromium where the rebels had gathered, believing themselves victorious. Then the army struck. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in a single day. The revolt ended not with negotiation, but annihilation. The city was scarred, but the throne was secure. Theodora's role in this moment permanently altered how power was perceived within the empire. She had not commanded troops, yet she had determined the outcome. Her courage was not reckless, it was calculated. She recognized that fear spreads faster than fire, and that authority survives only when it refuses to retreat. After the revolt, her influence only deepened. Officials who had hesitated were sidelined. Loyalty became the currency of survival. The rebuilt Constantinople monuments, churches, and laws rose from ashes shaped by Theodora's iron resolve. The Nar Revolt revealed her true nature. She was not merely Justinian's equal in intellect. She was in moments of crisis his anchor. Where others saw ruin, Theodora saw the narrow path to absolute control, and she walked it without hesitation. With the empire stabilized after the Nar Revolt, Theodora turned her attention to something less dramatic, but far more enduring, the law. While Justinian is remembered as the great codifier of Roman law, the reforms of his reign were not crafted by jurists alone. Behind many of the most radical changes stood Theodora, shaping legislation with the clarity of someone who had lived under the system's harshest blind spots. Theodora pushed relentlessly for legal protections for women, especially those society preferred to forget. She championed laws that criminalized forced prostitution and punished men who exploited vulnerable women. For the first time, rape was treated as a serious crime, regardless of the victim's social status. Divorce laws were altered to allow women greater agency, and property rights were expanded so wives were no longer legally invisible within marriage. These were not symbolic gestures. They altered daily life for thousands. Perhaps most telling was her creation of safe houses for former prostitutes, state-supported institutions where women could live without being dragged back into exploitation. Critics mocked these efforts as sentimental or hypocritical. Pointing to her past, Theodora ignored them. She understood that moral authority did not come from purity, but from resolve. Her reforms were unapologetically interventionist. The state, she believed, had a responsibility to restrain abuse, not excuse it. Her influence extended beyond gender. Theodora consistently argued for mercy toward the poor and restraint toward religious minorities. She saw persecution not as strength but as administrative failure. When dissent was crushed too harshly, it bred martyrs. When managed carefully, it dissolved. This philosophy quietly shaped imperial policy, even when it contradicted the instincts of military commanders and bishops. What unsettled the aristocracy was not merely the content of these reforms, but their source. Law had always flowed downward from elite men trained in rhetoric and lineage. Now it was being reshaped by a woman whose authority came from experience rather than pedigree. Theodora did not argue theory. She argued consequences. By embedding compassion into imperial law, she altered the moral architecture of Byzantium. The empire did not become gentle, but it became more controlled, more deliberate, and less casually cruel. Long after fires were extinguished and rebellions forgotten, these laws remained. Theodora understood something few rulers ever grasp. Violence secures power quickly, but law secures it quietly. And quietly, she rewrote the empire in her own image. As Justinian's reign matured, the empire faced a quieter, but equally dangerous threat: religious fracture. Doctrinal conflict cut through cities and villages, dividing families, provoking riots, and undermining loyalty to the throne. Official policy enforced Caledonian orthodoxy, but large populations, especially in Egypt and Syria, remained loyal to Monophysite Christianity. Crushing them outright risked rebellion, tolerating them openly risked accusations of weakness. This was the dilemma Theodora chose to manage personally. Theodora was herself sympathetic to the Monophysite cause, but she was not reckless. She never attempted to overturn official doctrine. Instead, she worked from the shadows, offering protection rather than proclamation. Monophysite bishops were secretly housed within palace compounds, shielded from arrest, interrogated privately rather than publicly humiliated, and quietly allowed to maintain networks of influence. Theodora turned the imperial court into a place of unofficial asylum. This approach served two purposes. It reduced unrest in the provinces while allowing Justinian to maintain the appearance of theological authority. Where the emperor ruled by decree, Theodora ruled by access. She decided who was heard, who was spared, and who was silenced discreetly. In an empire where religion and politics were inseparable, this made her one of the most powerful figures alive. Not everyone approved. Orthodox clergy resented her interference, and court insiders whispered that she was undermining the spiritual unity of the empire. Theodora responded with patience rather than confrontation. She understood that belief could not be coerced into obedience. Stability required tolerance carefully disguised as discipline. Her religious policy reflected her broader worldview. Theodora did not believe in absolute conformity. She believed in containment. Differences could exist as long as they did not challenge the throne. Violence in her mind was a sign that governance had failed upstream. Even Justinian, a man deeply invested in theological legacy, deferred to her judgment in these matters more often than sources openly admit. When tensions threatened to boil over, it was usually Theodora who advised restraint, delay, or quiet compromise. She had learned long ago that people pushed hard eventually push back harder. By managing belief as a political force rather than a moral battlefield, Theodora kept the empire from tearing itself apart. Her faith was real, but her loyalty was always to stability. In Byzantium, that distinction meant survival. This chapter of her rule reveals her most subtle strength. Theodora did not need public victories. She was content shaping outcomes invisibly, confident that history would move in the direction she set. Even if it never spoke her name aloud, by the late years of Justinian's reign, the nature of authority in Byzantium had quietly shifted. The court still revolved around the emperor, but those who mattered understood an unspoken truth. Access to power ran just as decisively through Theodora. Petitions, appointments, and survival itself often depended on whether one had fallen into her favor or her suspicion. She did not need proclamations to rule. Influence was enough. Theodora was feared not because she was unpredictable, but because she was consistent. She rewarded loyalty without sentiment and punished betrayal without hesitation. Officials who mistook her silence for weakness rarely made the same mistake twice. She had no interest in theatrical cruelty, yet she was untroubled by severity when stability demanded it. Mercy, in her view, was a tool, not a reflex. Her relationship with Justinian during these years was one of deep interdependence. Justinian remained the visionary, builder of monuments, codifier of law, dreamer of Roman restoration. Theodora was the realist. She tempered his ambitions, restrained his impulses, and absorbed the political cost of unpopular decisions. Where he thought in centuries, she thought in consequences. Illness began to shadow her life during this period, likely cancer, though contemporary sources avoid clinical certainty. Even as her health declined, her authority did not. She continued to receive officials from her chambers, issue instructions, and manage court rivalries with undiminished sharpness. Physical weakness did not translate into political retreat. If anything, her judgment grew colder, more refined. What unsettled observers most was her refusal to mythologize herself. Theodora did not cultivate public devotion, nor did she attempt to soften her image. She allowed enemies to hate her openly, confident that fear outlasted affection. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and appearances, she operated almost without illusion. Power was not sacred, it was practical. Foreign envoys took note. Diplomacy increasingly accounted for Theodora's preferences, even when negotiating with the emperor himself. This was unprecedented. An empress had become a fixed variable in imperial calculation, not an ornament to be acknowledged politely. As her life narrowed, her legacy widened. Theodora had proven that authority could be built from experience rather than lineage, from intelligence rather than tradition. She did not dismantle the empire's structures, she mastered them. In doing so, she left behind a dangerous precedent, that power could belong to those bold enough to claim it and disciplined enough to keep it. In the year 548, Theodora died after a long illness, likely cancer. She was not yet 50. There were no dramatic final words recorded, no staged farewell to the court. Her power ended quietly, the way she often preferred to exercise it, without spectacle. Yet the absence she left behind was immediate and destabilizing. Byzantium had lost not just an empress, but its sharpest political mind. Justinian survived her by nearly 2 decades, but his reign after her death was never the same. He continued to legislate, to build, to dream of imperial restoration, yet something essential had vanished. Advisors once checked by Theodora's realism now spoke more freely. Religious policy hardened. Military ambition stretched further than resources could sustain. The balance she had maintained between mercy and force, belief and control slowly eroded. Contemporary reactions to her death revealed how deeply she had divided opinion. Supporters mourned a protector of the vulnerable, a ruler who understood suffering because she had lived it. Critics exhaled in relief. portraying her as manipulative, cruel, and dangerously ambitious. Many accounts written after her death, especially by hostile chroniclers, rewrote her life as scandal and excess, reducing decades of governance to moral judgment. It was easier to condemn her past than confront her competence. Yet lore remembers what gossip forgets. The reforms she championed remained in force. Protections for women endured. Limits on exploitation held. Her quiet tolerance toward religious minorities left institutional traces long after her personal networks vanished. The empire continued to operate inside a framework she had helped design, even as it pretended she had been a temporary anomaly. Theodora's legacy was uncomfortable because it disrupted narrative order. She was not born noble yet ruled nobles. She was not trained as a scholar yet shaped law. She was not a general yet decided battles. Byzantium preferred its power draped in tradition. Theodora exposed power as something learned, not inherited. After her death, the court tried to return to familiar hierarchies, but precedent cannot be erased. Future empresses would be measured against her, whether openly acknowledged or not. She had expanded the possible. Theodora did not leave monuments bearing her name alone. She left a warning and an example. An empire may survive brilliance without compassion, or compassion without strength. But under her rule, Byzantium learned what happens when both exist in the same person. Long after her death, Theodora refused to remain silent in history. She lingered in law codes, court memory, and imperial anxiety, an unresolved presence that Byzantium never fully reconciled. Chroniclers struggled to contain her within familiar categories. She was too ruthless to be a saint, too protective of the vulnerable to be a tyrant, too effective to be dismissed as a scandal. So they argued about her instead. That argument became her afterlife. Later writers, especially those hostile to her religious sympathies or unsettled by her origins, leaned heavily on her early years. They turned survival into sin and ambition into depravity. This was not accidental. Attacking her morality was safer than confronting her competence. Theodora had ruled too well to be ignored, so she was attacked where power was not supposed to exist, in a woman who had risen from nothing. Yet even her enemies could not erase the evidence of her rule. The Byzantine state that followed her death bore the marks of her decisions. Women retained protections they had never known before. The poor had precedents for imperial intervention. Religious minorities remembered that restraint had once existed at the highest level, and emperors learned quietly that unchecked ambition without internal balance could hollow a reign. Theodora's true legacy was not a single reform or moment of courage, it was a new model of authority. She proved that power did not require noble birth, military command, or public adoration. It required understanding people, how they fear, how they obey, how they break. She ruled not by illusion, but by precision. In mosaics, she appears frozen in gold, robed in imperial splendor, distant and untouchable. But the real Theodora was shaped by hunger, humiliation, and endurance. She carried those experiences into the palace and never forgot them. That memory made her dangerous to those who ruled by habit and invaluable to those who ruled by necessity. Byzantium survived many emperors. Few altered its internal logic. Theodora did. She changed what was possible inside power itself. Her life remains unsettling because it offers no comfort. There is no redemption arc that ends in softness, no punishment that restores moral order. There is only competence sharpened by hardship exercised without apology. And that, more than any scandal or legend, is why Theodora endures. Europe was already worn thin by crusading failure. Jerusalem remained beyond Christian control. Knights had marched east and returned broken, and faith simmered with frustration rather than triumph. Many believed God was displeased with warriors stained by greed and violence. If armed men had failed, perhaps innocence would succeed. It was in this climate that one of the strangest ideas in medieval history took root, that children pure of sin could reclaim the Holy Land through faith alone. The movement began not in palaces or monasteries but in villages. In northern France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Clayses claimed that Christ had appeared to him in the form of a poor pilgrim. According to Stephen, he was given a letter for the King of France and a divine command: gather children and lead them to Jerusalem. Word spread quickly. In a society where visions were taken seriously and miracles expected, skepticism was rare. The story carried a powerful appeal. God had chosen the humble. God had chosen the young. Children began to gather. Though children is misleading, many were adolescents, some were young adults, and others were the poorest members of society regardless of age. They had no weapons, no supplies, and no plan beyond belief. They sang hymns as they marched, convinced the Mediterranean would part before them as the Red Sea once had. Parents tried to intervene. Local priests often failed to stop them. Some even encouraged the movement, seeing it as a sign of divine renewal. This was not a crusade authorized by the church. No pope called it. No bishops organized it. That absence of official control was precisely what made it spread so fast. The movement fed on rumor, sermons, and emotion. Hunger, plague, and social inequality had already destabilized communities. The Children's Crusade gave meaning to suffering. It offered a role to those with none. Medieval Europe did not separate faith from reality. If God wished to act through children, then logistics were irrelevant. Miracles would fill the gaps. That belief was not naive by medieval standards. It was normal. What made the Children's Crusade truly dangerous was not fanaticism, but sincerity. These young pilgrims believed completely. They trusted strangers. They trusted visions. They trusted that the world would bend to faith. And because they believed so deeply, they marched forward without fear. By the time authorities realized what was happening, the movement had already escaped control. Thousands were on the road. The dream had taken hold, and dreams once released are very hard to stop. As the movement spread beyond France, a parallel procession began forming east of the Rhine. In the German lands, a boy named Nicholas of Cologne emerged as a prophetic figure, preaching that God had chosen the young to succeed where armored knights had failed. Like Stephen, Nicholas promised miracles. He claimed angels would guide the faithful and that the sea itself would open before them. For thousands of desperate families, this message was irresistible. Soon, roads filled with children and adolescents abandoning their villages. Some left secretly at night, others departed openly, singing hymns and carrying crude crosses. Not all were truly young. Many were poor laborers, shepherds, beggars, and runaways who blended into the crowds. Medieval chroniclers later used the word children more to describe social status than age. These were the powerless, the overlooked, the disposable, now united by belief. The march itself was brutal. Summer heat scorched the roads, food was scarce, and disease spread quickly among the crowds. There was no central authority, no supply lines, no protection. Those who fell behind were left behind. Some died quietly in ditches. Others turned back in shame, returning home to villages that no longer recognized them. But many pressed on, driven by collective momentum. To stop walking felt like doubting God. As the columns moved south through the Alps, reality intruded more harshly. Mountain passes were unforgiving. Children collapsed from exhaustion. Locals sometimes offered food or shelter, moved by pity or faith. Others saw opportunity. Thieves preyed on the marchers. Unscrupulous guides demanded payment to lead them onward. The crusade had no defenses against exploitation. Clergy reactions were mixed. Some priests warned that this was madness, not holiness. Others hesitated, fearing to oppose what might be divine will. In a world where miracles were expected, restraint could look like disbelief. That hesitation proved fatal. The movement was never formally blessed, but it was never decisively condemned either. Silence became permission. The most powerful force driving the march was not leadership, but community. Each child looked to the others for confirmation. If everyone believed, then belief must be right. Doubt became isolation. Faith became survival. By the time the German and French groups approached the Mediterranean coast, thousands had already vanished through death, desertion, or quiet collapse. Yet those who remained believed they were the chosen few. They had endured suffering, and suffering they believed proved God's favor. They were wrong, but they had not yet learned how wrong. By late summer, the surviving groups reached the Mediterranean, convinced the final miracle was at hand. For the French followers of Stephen, the destination was Marseilles. For the German marchers led by Nicholas, it was Genoa. In their imagination, this was the moment history would bend. As Moses had crossed the Red Sea, so too would they walk dry into the Holy Land. All suffering would be justified. All doubt would vanish. The sea did not open. At Genoa, the children waited. They prayed, sang, and stared at the water. Certain delay was part of God's plan. When nothing happened, confusion crept in. Some locals mocked them, others pied them. The city authorities, alarmed by the growing number of starving pilgrims, ordered them to disperse. A few children accepted offers of work or shelter. Many simply sat on the shore, unwilling to abandon belief, even as it collapsed around them. Nicholas urged his followers onward, insisting that the miracle would occur elsewhere. A smaller group continued south toward Rome. Along the way, hunger and illness thinned their numbers further. When they finally reached the Pope, he did not bless their mission. Instead, he praised their faith and told them to return home. It was a gentle dismissal, but devastating. The crusade was over, even if no one wanted to admit it. In Marseilles, events took a darker turn. To merchants offered to transport the children across the sea free of charge. To exhausted pilgrims, this seemed like divine intervention. Ships were boarded. Hymns were sung. Hope surged one last time. Then the ships sailed and never returned as promised. What happened next is pieced together from fragments and later testimony. Some ships were wrecked in storms, drowning everyone aboard. Others reached ports in North Africa where the children were sold into slavery. Faith had made them trusting. Trust made them easy to betray. The tragedy of the children's crusade lies not only in what had happened, but in how inevitable it became. Once belief replaced structure, anyone could claim authority. Once miracles were expected, lies flourished easily. The children were not defeated by enemies in the Holy Land. They were undone by the world they passed through. Standing on the shore, watching the sea remain stubbornly unchanged, many must have felt something break inside them, not just hope, but the certainty that God was watching closely. That realization, quiet and terrible, marked the true end of the crusade. After the sea failed to open and the promised passage dissolved into lies, the children's crusade did not end cleanly. It unraveled. Those who survived the journey to the coast scattered across Europe, carrying stories too confusing and painful to explain. There was no official declaration of failure, no reckoning, no rescue effort. The movement simply collapsed into silence. For the children taken aboard ships from Marseilles, fate was sealed beyond their understanding. Later, chroniclers describe how they were transported to Muslim ports in North Africa and the eastern Mediterranean, where they were sold into slavery. Whether every detail is accurate matters less than the pattern. Children vanished and no serious attempt was made to recover them. They had no political value. No armies followed. No ransoms were negotiated. Once gone, they were gone. Those who remained behind fared little better. Many were stranded in foreign cities with no money and no way home. Some were taken in by monasteries or families, absorbed quietly into new lives. Others starved. A few returned home only to be rejected by parents who could not understand why they had left or what they had believed. The crusade did not make them heroes, it made them burdens. Church authorities responded cautiously. No one wanted responsibility. The movement had never been officially sanctioned, which made condemnation safer than accountability. The Pope at the time, Innocent III, reportedly praised the children's faith while insisting that crusading was not their role. It was a careful statement, admiration without obligation. The institution preserved its authority by distancing itself from the consequences. What followed was historical discomfort. Chroniclers disagreed about numbers, leaders, and even whether the crusade truly happened as described. Some later writers suggested it was exaggerated, symbolic, or misunderstood. Others insisted it was real, but misrepresented. This confusion was not accidental. The Children's Crusade was easier to blur than to confront. It exposed uncomfortable truths about medieval society, how easily belief could be weaponized, how little protection existed for the powerless, and how quickly moral enthusiasm could excuse negligence. The children had believed they were chosen. Instead, they were abandoned, not by God, perhaps, but by every structure meant to protect them. Faith had propelled them forward. Silence met them at the end. The tragedy of the Children's Crusade is not only that children suffered, it is that their suffering produced no reform, no apology, no lesson officially learned. History absorbed them quietly, the way it often absorbs the powerless. They marched, believing the world would change for them. Instead, they vanished into it. Almost as soon as the Children's Crusade ended, arguments began over what had actually happened. Medieval chroniclers struggled to describe the event without undermining their own moral world. A mass movement driven by faith had ended not in miracle, but in neglect and exploitation. That was dangerous territory, so the story fractured. Some accounts insisted the march was literal and vast, involving tens of thousands of children. Others reduced it to a handful of misguided youths led astray by rumor. A few writers reinterpreted the word children to mean the poor or socially dependent rather than the young. This ambiguity allowed later generations to soften the horror. If they were not really children, then the tragedy felt less unbearable. Modern historians still debate the details. Numbers were likely exaggerated. Leadership was probably looser than legend suggests. But skepticism does not erase the core reality. Large groups of young, vulnerable people traveled long distances driven by religious conviction, and many never returned. Whether the movement numbered in the thousands or the hundreds, its consequences were real for those who vanished. The confusion surrounding the Children's Crusade reveals how history protects institutions. A clear narrative would demand responsibility. A blurred one allows distance. No single authority could be blamed. No formal apology was required. The event drifted into folklore, sermon illustration, and cautionary tale rather than political failure. Over time, the crusade became symbolic. Preachers used it to warn against fanaticism. Moralists used it to praise innocent faith corrupted by the world. Romantic writers later recast it as tragic purity betrayed by cynical adults. Each retelling reshaped the event to fit contemporary needs. The children themselves disappeared behind interpretation. What is striking is how little the movement changed policy. There was no reform of pilgrimage practices, no new safeguards for the young, no serious attempt to regulate charismatic preaching among the poor. The lesson absorbed was not protect the vulnerable, but do not speak of this too clearly. The Children's Crusade sits uncomfortably between myth and documentation because it exposes a fault line in medieval Christianity. Faith was supposed to save. Here it endangered. Obedience was supposed to protect. Here it is. The crusade forced an implicit question few wanted to answer. What happens when belief runs ahead of responsibility? That question was quietly buried. History remembers the Children's Crusade not because it changed the world, but because it failed so completely. It stands as a reminder that sincerity does not prevent tragedy, and that devotion, when unguarded, can become a weapon against those who hold it most purely. What made the Children's Crusade possible was not only belief, but the way medieval society understood innocence. Children were seen as closer to God, uncorrupted by sin, untainted by greed. This idea was powerful and dangerous. It allowed adults to project hope onto the young while avoiding responsibility for their safety. Innocence became a justification rather than a protection. Many adults did not stop the children because stopping them felt like opposing God's will. If children were chosen, interference was doubt. Doubt in a deeply religious culture was a moral failure. Parents hesitated. Priests hesitated. Officials hesitated. Each delay allowed the movement to grow. What should have triggered alarm instead inspired awe. At the same time, innocence made the children exploitable. They trusted easily, they believed authority was benevolent. They assumed adults would not lie to them about something sacred. That trust was rewarded with manipulation. Guides charged money. Merchants offered transport. Strangers promised miracles. Few were punished afterward because the victims had no voice and no advocates. The crusade also revealed a brutal social truth. Poor children mattered less. Many who joined were already marginal, hungry, homeless, or unwanted. Their disappearance did not destabilize power structures. There were no noble families demanding answers, no economic consequences, no political pressure. The loss was absorbed quietly by the lowest levels of society. In this way, the Children's Crusade functioned as a kind of moral blind spot. Everyone involved could claim good intentions. No one needed to accept guilt. Faith explained everything. Tragedy became misfortune rather than failure. The language surrounding the event reinforced this avoidance. Chroniclers praised devotion rather than questioned outcomes. Sermons emphasized purity rather than protection. Even condemnation focused on false leaders, not on the collective refusal to intervene. Responsibility was always displaced onto God, onto fate, onto unnamed deceivers. What the children learned, if they survived, was harsher. They learned that belief did not guarantee safety, that adults could fail them without consequence, that sacred language could conceal selfish motives. These lessons were never written into law or theology, but they were carried forward quietly in memory. The Children's Crusade was not a collapse of faith. It was a collapse of guardianship. Society admired innocence, but did not defend it. That contradiction sits at the heart of the tragedy, and it raises an unsettling question that echoes far beyond the Middle Ages. When innocence inspires action, who is responsible for the consequences? In 1212, no one answered. For those who survived the Children's Crusade, the hardest part often began after the journey ended. Returning home did not bring relief. It brought silence, disbelief, and shame. Villages had changed. Families had adapted to absence, and the children who returned were no longer the same people who had left singing hymns on the road. Some survivors came back thinner, sick, and exhausted, carrying stories few wanted to hear. Parents struggled to understand how faith had led their children so far and cost so much. In some places, returning pilgrims were welcomed with relief. In others, they were met with suspicion. Why had they failed? Why had God not protected them? In a world that believed success revealed divine favor, failure demanded explanation, and survivors were often expected to provide it. Many never returned at all, not because they died, but because there was nowhere to go back to. Some had been orphans before the march, others came from families so poor that leaving had changed nothing. These children drifted into monasteries, farms, or urban labor, absorbed quietly into new lives. Their past was rarely recorded. History remembers leaders and disasters, not the slow anonymity of survival. Those who had been enslaved and later freed carried deeper scars. They had seen faith weaponized against them and trust sold for profit. For them, the crusade was not a theological failure, but a human one. Yet, their voices are almost entirely absent from the record. Medieval chroniclers wrote about belief, symbolism, and numbers, not trauma. What is striking is how quickly society moved on. There were no public rituals of mourning, no monuments, no institutional reckoning. The movement vanished into rumor and moral debate while the survivors carried the consequences alone. This forgetting was not accidental. Remembering too clearly would have required uncomfortable questions about authority, obedience, and responsibility. In later years, some former participants reportedly joined other pilgrimages or crusades, attempting to reclaim meaning from loss. Others withdrew from public religious life altogether. Both responses reflect the same struggle: how to reconcile belief with abandonment. The Children's Crusade did not end in a single moment. It ended gradually in kitchens and fields, in monasteries and streets. As survivors learned that the world had not changed for them, they had marched believing they were chosen. They returned knowing they were replaceable. History often measures events by outcomes. The true outcome of the Children's Crusade was not failure in the Holy Land, but disillusionment at home. And that disillusionment quietly endured may have shaped medieval faith far more than the legends ever admitted. As decades passed, the Children's Crusade settled into an uneasy place in European memory. It was too tragic to celebrate, too embarrassing to commemorate, and too morally complex to explain simply. Unlike failed military crusades, which could be blamed on strategy or enemy strength, this one exposed a failure of care. No ruler declared it, no army commanded it, yet everyone had watched it happen. This made the event uniquely uncomfortable. Responsibility was diffuse. Parents had let their children go. Clergy had hesitated to intervene. Local authorities had lacked either the will or the means to stop it. Merchants and opportunists had exploited it. And the Church, while never authorizing the crusade, had also never decisively condemned it until it was too late. Each group could point elsewhere. As a result, the story was gradually softened. Chroniclers emphasized miracle language over suffering. Numbers were blurred, ages were redefined. The crusade was reframed as misguided enthusiasm rather than catastrophic neglect. Over time, it became safer to argue about whether it had really happened than to confront what it revealed. This pattern, confusion replacing accountability, was not unique. Medieval society relied heavily on faith to explain events, especially disasters. When outcomes contradicted belief, reinterpretation became a survival mechanism. God's will was mysterious. Human failure could be absorbed into divine silence. Yet, the Children's Crusade resisted clean theological closure. There was no redemptive ending, no martyrdom that restored meaning, just loss that made it dangerous as a lesson. If pure faith could lead to such destruction, what did that say about obedience, authority, and trust? So the event became a warning told indirectly. Preachers used it cautiously. Scholars debated it abstractly. Storytellers romanticized it. Each approach distanced the present from the past. The children themselves faded into symbols. What endured was not a policy change, but a quiet instinct for control. Later, crusading movements were more tightly regulated. Unauthorized preaching faced greater scrutiny. Pilgrimage became more institutional. These shifts were never explicitly linked to the Children's Crusade, but they followed its shadow. The tragedy had left a mark even if no one admitted it. The Children's Crusade was not erased from history. It was diluted, and in that dilution lies its final cruelty. The suffering was real, but the lesson was never spoken aloud. Silence once again proved more convenient than truth. The Children's Crusade endures not because it changed borders or theology, but because it exposes a recurring human failure. It shows what happens when belief outruns responsibility, when sincerity is mistaken for safety, and when admiration for innocence replaces the duty to protect it. The tragedy lies less in the march itself than in the number of adults who stepped aside and allowed it to continue. This was not a story of evil masterminds orchestrating destruction. It was a story of hesitation. Parents feared opposing what might be God's will. Clergy feared being seen as faithless. Authorities feared acting without clear mandate. Each delay felt small. Together, they became fatal. The Children's Crusade reminds us that harm often occurs not through cruelty, but through inaction justified by virtue. It also challenges the comforting idea that pure intentions guarantee good outcomes. The children believed with extraordinary intensity. They prayed, fasted, and endured suffering willingly. None of that protected them. Faith gave them courage, but it did not give them food, ships, or defenders. When belief was not paired with structure, it left them exposed to hunger, deception, and violence. The episode forces an uncomfortable question. Who is responsible when the vulnerable are inspired into danger? Medieval society answered that question poorly. So have many societies since. Again and again, young people are praised for conviction while being denied protection. Passion is celebrated, consequences are ignored. The Children's Crusade also reveals how history treats the powerless. Knights who failed were recorded, debated, and redeemed. Children who vanished were argued over, then forgotten. Their suffering became a footnote, a moral anecdote, a historiographical puzzle. Yet each lost child lived a full reality that history reduced to uncertainty. What makes the event so haunting is its familiarity. The language changes, the century changes, but the pattern remains. Idealism is encouraged, safeguards lag behind. Responsibility dissolves. Then, after the damage, society debates definitions instead of outcomes. The Children's Crusade does not demand belief or disbelief. It demands memory. It asks us to notice how easily devotion can be exploited, how quickly institutions retreat when accountability is unclear, and how silence often follows preventable harm. In 1212, thousands walked south believing the world would move for them. It did not. The lesson they paid for was simple and brutal. Faith without protection is not purity, it is exposure. And that lesson, unlike the crusade itself, has never stopped being relevant. On an October night in 1957, Americans stepped outside and looked up. Moving steadily across the dark sky was a tiny point of light blinking with cold precision. It was Sputnik, the first artificial satellite ever placed into orbit. It was small, simple, and scientifically limited, but its impact was enormous. In a single moment, the balance of confidence in the Cold War shifted. Until then, the United States had assumed technological leadership was guaranteed. It had emerged from World War II with industrial dominance, nuclear weapons, and a belief that innovation naturally favored democratic systems. Space was seen as a future arena, not an immediate threat. Sputnik shattered that illusion. If the Soviet Union could place an object above American cities, it could also place weapons there. The sky was no longer empty, it was contested. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Newspapers warned of a missile gap. Politicians accused each other of negligence. Parents worried that American schools were failing their children. Science and mathematics were suddenly matters of national survival. Sputnik did not just orbit the Earth, it orbited the American psyche. What made the moment worse was the realization that the United States had the technology to respond, but not the structure. Rocket research was scattered across military branches and civilian agencies, each competing for prestige, funding, and control. The Army, Navy, and Air Force ran overlapping programs with little coordination. Brilliant engineers existed, but vision was fragmented. Sputnik exposed that weakness mercilessly. President Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the danger of panic, but he also recognized the scale of the problem. This was not just a race for space, it was a test of national organization. Eisenhower resisted calls for reckless escalation, but he agreed on one thing. The United States needed a unified civilian space agency, one that could pursue exploration without being driven solely by military fear. Behind closed doors, discussions moved quickly. Space could no longer be treated as a side project. It needed centralized leadership, clear goals, and public legitimacy. The response to Sputnik would shape not just technology, but education, industry, and global prestige. Sputnik's signal was faint, but its message was deafening. The Cold War had left the ground, and the United States, suddenly aware it was behind, began preparing a response that would redefine humanity's relationship with the cosmos. The shock of Sputnik forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable truth. It already possessed much of the knowledge needed to reach space, but it lacked a coherent system to use it. For decades, aeronautical research had been handled by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, better known as NACA. Founded during the First World War, NACA had quietly become one of the most sophisticated research bodies in the world. Its wind tunnels, laboratories, and engineers shaped nearly every major American aircraft design. But NACA was built for air, not space. As rockets replaced propellers, NACA found itself at a crossroads. Its scientists understood high-speed flight, heat, and control, exactly the problem space travel would create. Yet, its mandate was narrow and its culture cautious. It advised, it tested, it did not lead grand national missions. Sputnik made that restraint unacceptable. Within months, the Eisenhower administration began reshaping the American approach to space. The decision was deliberate. Space exploration would be civilian-led, not dominated by the military. This was both strategic and symbolic. A civilian agency could present space flight as peaceful exploration rather than orbital warfare. It would also prevent rivalry between military branches from paralyzing progress. In 1958, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. With it, NACA was dissolved and reborn as the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA inherited NACA's facilities, personnel, and institutional memory, but its mission was vastly expanded. It would explore space, it would coordinate national effort, and it would do so in full public view. The transition was not smooth. Engineers accustomed to quiet research suddenly found themselves working under political scrutiny and public expectation. Timelines tightened. Failures became headlines. Budgets exploded. NASA was no longer an advisory body. It was a symbol of national urgency. Crucially, NASA absorbed more than just NACA. It drew in military rocket programs, scientific satellites, and experimental projects that had previously competed with one another. For the first time, the United States had a single organization tasked with reaching beyond Earth. Fragmentation gave way to focus. This transformation marked a philosophical shift. Space was no longer a side effect of weapons development, it was a destination in its own right. Exploration, science, and prestige were fused into one mission. NASA's creation did not erase fear of Soviet power, it harnessed it. The panic sparked by Sputnik was converted into structure, funding, and ambition. The United States had stumbled, but now it had chosen how to run. The race to space had gained an engine. With NASA officially established, the pressure to produce results became overwhelming. The Soviet Union was still ahead, still launching satellites and still controlling the narrative of technological superiority. The United States did not have the luxury of perfection, it needed speed. Out of that urgency emerged Project Mercury, a program defined by a single, brutally simple goal: put an American human into space and bring them back alive. Mercury was not designed for elegance or long-term exploration, it was a crash program. Engineers worked under relentless deadlines, adapting existing rocket technology that had never been meant for human passengers. Safety margins were thin, failures were expected. The question was not whether something would go wrong, but whether NASA could survive mistakes in public view. One of the most controversial decisions NASA made was to select military test pilots as astronauts. These men were disciplined, accustomed to danger, and already comfortable being instruments of national policy. They were not scientists, they were not explorers in the romantic sense. They were chosen because they could follow orders precisely and remain calm while riding experimental machines that barely worked. The media quickly turned them into heroes. The Mercury 7 became symbols of courage and masculinity in an anxious nation. But inside NASA, the mood was far less celebratory. Every launch risked humiliation. A single televised failure could confirm fears that America simply could not compete. Early tests were disastrous. Rockets exploded on launch pads. Capsules malfunctioned. Animals sent ahead of humans barely survived. Each setback fed criticism that NASA was rushing too fast, that space flight was being driven by politics rather than readiness. Those critics were not wrong, but delay carried its own cost. In 1961, the gamble paid off partially. Alan Shepard became the first American in space, though only on a brief suborbital flight. It was a symbolic victory, not a strategic one. The Soviet Union had already placed a human into orbit. Still, the flight mattered. It proved NASA could launch, control, and recover a human mission under pressure. Project Mercury did not close the gap. It revealed it, but it also did something essential. It showed that NASA could operate at Cold War speed without collapsing. Procedures hardened, confidence grew, engineers learned how to fail forward. Mercury was never meant to win the space race. It was meant to prove the United States belonged in it. And in that narrow, dangerous sense, it succeeded. Project Mercury proved that Americans could survive space flight, but it did nothing to resolve the central problem. The United States was still behind. The Soviet Union had reached orbit first, stayed longer, and captured the imagination of the world. NASA needed a goal so large, so definitive that it would reset the race entirely. That goal arrived not from engineers, but from politics. In May 1961, President John F. Kennedy addressed Congress and issued a challenge that stunned both the nation and NASA itself. The United States would commit to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out. At the time, this was an audacious promise bordering on reckless. The technology did not exist, the path was unclear. Failure was a real possibility. Kennedy's decision was not driven by scientific curiosity, it was strategic. A lunar landing offered a clear, dramatic victory that could not be matched incrementally. Either it happened, or it did not. There was no partial credit. That clarity transformed NASA overnight. Budgets exploded. Facilities multiplied. Entire regions of the country were reshaped by space infrastructure. NASA grew into a massive organization, coordinating hundreds of thousands of workers across universities, private companies, and military contractors. The moon became not just a destination, but a deadline. To reach it, NASA needed more than Mercury could offer. It required experience in long-duration flight, rendezvous, and maneuvering in space. This led to Project Gemini, a program designed to turn raw astronauts into skilled operators. Gemini missions tested docking, spacewalks, endurance, and precision navigation. Mistakes were common, danger remained constant. The pace was unforgiving. Astronauts trained relentlessly. Engineers worked around the clock, each mission built on the last, stacking risk and knowledge together. There was no room for complacency. Every failure carried political consequences. Kennedy did not live to see the outcome of his promise. His assassination in 1963 cast a shadow over the program. Yet the commitment endured. By then the moon effort had become irreversible. Too much money, pride, and momentum were invested to turn back. This chapter marked the moment NASA transformed from a reactive agency into a driver of national ambition. Space exploration was no longer about catching up. It was about redefining what victory looked like. The moon was distant, the timeline was brutal. But the promise had been made, and NASA now existed to keep it. With the moon deadline looming, NASA entered the most intense phase of its existence. The challenge was no longer conceptual, it was logistical, industrial, and human. Landing on the moon required solving thousands of problems simultaneously, many of which had never been encountered before. Space was unforgiving and the margin for error was effectively zero. At the center of this effort stood Apollo program, the largest peacetime technological project in history. Apollo was not a single mission, but an entire ecosystem of rockets, spacecraft, computers, training regimes, and contingency plans. It demanded new factories, new launch complexes, and new ways of managing complexity. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted. NASA made a crucial strategic decision early on: lunar orbit rendezvous. Instead of landing a massive spacecraft on the moon, a smaller module would detach, land, and then rejoin a command ship in lunar orbit. The idea was risky and controversial. If docking failed, the crew would be stranded, but it was the only approach that made the mission feasible within the decade. Once again, NASA chose risk over delay. The workforce behind Apollo was vast and young. Engineers in their 20s made decisions that could kill astronauts. Programmers wrote code with less computing power than a modern calculator. Yet that code would guide humans across hundreds of thousands of miles. Mistakes were inevitable and some were catastrophic. In January 1967, disaster struck. During a ground test, a fire swept through the Apollo 1 command module, killing 3 astronauts. The nation watched in horror. The tragedy exposed design flaws, complacency, and the deadly cost of schedule pressure. For a moment, the entire program seemed in jeopardy. NASA stopped. It tore the spacecraft apart, literally and institutionally. Procedures were rewritten. Materials were replaced. Culture changed. Safety became an obsession. The pause was painful but essential. Apollo would not survive without humility. When flights resumed, they did so with heart and resolve. Each mission tested another piece of the lunar puzzle. Rockets thundered, crews trained relentlessly. Failures were studied, not hidden. Apollo was no longer just about beating the Soviets. It was about proving that human ambition could be matched by discipline. The moon was still distant, but the machinery to reach it was finally real. NASA had learned the hardest lesson of all. Speed without reckoning leads only to tragedy. By the summer of 1969, NASA stood on the edge of everything it had promised. After years of testing, tragedy, redesign, and relentless pressure, the Apollo program was ready to attempt what had once seemed impossible. Apollo 11 was chosen to make the attempt, not because it was perfect, but because it was ready enough. The mission carried 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Each had a role shaped by risk. Armstrong and Aldrin would descend to the moon's surface in the lunar module. Collins would remain alone in lunar orbit, circling endlessly, knowing that if docking failed, his crewmates would die below him. The descent was anything but smooth. Alarms flashed, fuel ran dangerously low. Armstrong took manual control, guiding the lander away from a hazardous surface littered with rocks. Inside mission control, engineers ran calculations at a pace that left no room for panic. Seconds mattered. When the lander finally touched down, there was fuel left for less than half a minute. Then came silence, followed by confirmation. When Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, the moment transcended science. It was watched live by hundreds of millions around the world. The words he spoke were carefully chosen, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was not just an American victory, it was a human one. In the Cold War, symbolism mattered as much as hardware, and no symbol had ever been larger. The flag planted on the moon was political, but the images were universal. Humans walking on another world rewrote the boundaries of the possible. The Soviet Union, watching closely, had no equivalent response. The race had been decided not by orbit counts, but by spectacle and achievement. Yet, inside NASA, celebration was restrained. Too many knew how close the mission had come to disaster. Too many understood that success had balanced on judgment, improvisation, and luck. Apollo 11 did not prove that space flight was safe. It proved it was survivable. With that single mission, NASA fulfilled the promise made years earlier under pressure and doubt. The moon landing did not end the Cold War, but it ended the question of whether the United States could lead in space. NASA had reached the moon. The world would never look at the sky the same way again. The success of Apollo 11 was undeniable, but it created a problem few had anticipated. The race had been won. The goal that justified extraordinary budgets and risk was complete. Almost immediately, a quiet question emerged inside government and NASA itself. What now? Public interest peaked with the first landing, then began to fade. Subsequent Apollo missions were scientifically richer, more complex, and more dangerous, but they felt familiar. Walking on the moon had gone from miracle to routine in a matter of years. Television ratings declined, political attention shifted. The Cold War had not ended, but space was no longer its sharpest battlefield. NASA felt the change quickly. Funding tightened, missions were canceled. The ambitious plans for permanent lunar bases and human missions to Mars were quietly shelved. Apollo continued, but its momentum slowed. What had once been an unstoppable national project became vulnerable to budget committees and shifting priorities. Internally, NASA wrestled with identity. Was it an exploration agency, a scientific institution, or a geopolitical tool? During Apollo, it had been all three at once. Without the moon deadline, those roles began to pull in different directions. Engineers who had thrived under pressure now faced uncertainty. The agency that had been built for speed had to learn restraint, yet Apollo left behind more than footprints. Technologies developed for lunar missions spilled into civilian life. Computing, materials science, telecommunications, medical monitoring. More importantly, Apollo had built an infrastructure, launch facilities, mission control, training pipelines that could not simply be dismantled. NASA was too large, too visible, and too valuable to disappear. The question became how to justify space flight in peacetime. Exploration alone was not enough. NASA reframed its mission around science, Earth observation, and long-term presence in orbit. This transition would lead to new programs, new compromises, and new risks. Apollo had proven that humanity could reach another world under extreme pressure. What it had not answered was whether society would continue reaching once the pressure eased. Victory, it turned out, was simpler than direction. NASA stood at a crossroads. It could chase another grand gesture, or it could redefine what space was for. The choice would shape not just budgets, but the future of human presence beyond Earth. The age of crisis-driven exploration was ending. A quieter, more uncertain era was beginning. As the Apollo era wound down, NASA faced a reality it had never truly confronted before. Survival without urgency. The agency had been built to sprint, not to wander. With no immediate rival demanding dramatic victories, space flight had to justify itself through continuity rather than spectacle. The answer NASA chose was permanence in low Earth orbit. Out of this shift emerged the Space Shuttle program, a system designed not to conquer new worlds, but to make space accessible, repeatable, and economically defensible. The shuttle was a compromise shaped by politics as much as engineering. It promised reusability, frequent flights, and reduced cost. In reality, it delivered capability and flexibility at the price of complexity and risk. The shuttle transformed NASA's daily work. Astronauts became operators rather than pioneers. Missions focused on satellite deployment, scientific experiments, and military payloads. Space became a workplace. This shift mattered. It normalized human presence beyond Earth, even if it lacked Apollo's drama. Yet, the shuttle also exposed the limits of ambition under constraint to satisfy competing demands from Congress, the military, and the scientific community. The system grew fragile. Safety margins shrank. Warning signs accumulated. In 1986, the Challenger disaster shattered the illusion that routine meant safe. 17 years later, Columbia would repeat the lesson. These losses forced NASA to confront a painful truth. Space flight does not forgive complacency. Despite tragedy, the orbital strategy endured. NASA partnered internationally, culminating in the International Space Station, a permanent human outpost built not by competition, but by cooperation. Former Cold War rivals worked side by side. Space became a shared domain, rather than a battlefield. This period reshaped NASA's identity. It was no longer racing an enemy. It was managing complexity over decades. Success was measured in data, reliability, and incremental progress. Critics called it uninspiring. Supporters called it mature. What mattered most was continuity. Through shuttle flights and orbital stations, NASA preserved human space flight knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. Skills were passed forward, infrastructure was maintained. The path outward remained open, even if no one knew where it would lead next. The founding panic of 1958 had long faded. In its place stood an agency learning how to endure without fear. NASA had traded urgency for persistence. That trade would define its future and determine whether the age of cosmic ambition was paused or merely waiting. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration began as a reaction, an institution born from fear, embarrassment, and urgency. Yet over time, it became something far more enduring. What started as a Cold War response evolved into a framework for how humanity approaches the unknown. NASA's true legacy is not confined to flags on the moon or stations in orbit. It lies in the idea that exploration can be organized, sustained, and shared across generations. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, NASA had outlived the conditions that created it. The Soviet Union was gone. The missile gap was history, but space remained. Instead of rivalry, NASA increasingly embraced partnership with Europe, Japan, Canada, and even former adversaries. Exploration shifted from domination to collaboration. Science replaced spectacle as the primary justification. At the same time, a new reality emerged. Government was no longer the only driver of space flight. Private companies entered the arena, promising cheaper launches and faster innovation. NASA adapted again, stepping back from owning every vehicle and instead shaping goals, standards, and destinations. The agency that once built everything learned to orchestrate. This evolution did not diminish NASA's importance, it clarified it. NASA became the long-term architect of space ambition, the institution willing to take on risks and timelines too large for private industry alone. It pushed outward with robotic explorers, deep space telescopes, and plans for returning humans to the moon and eventually reaching Mars, each mission built on decades of accumulated knowledge. What makes NASA remarkable is not that it succeeded perfectly, but that it persisted. It absorbed tragedy without retreat. It reinvented itself without losing purpose. Few institutions survived the end of their founding crisis. NASA did. Looking back, the founding of NASA in 1958 was less about beating the Soviets than about answering a deeper question. How does a society respond when the future arrives sooner than expected? The answer was organization, investment, and belief that knowledge itself was a form of security. The Cold War panic that created NASA has faded into textbooks. The agency remains still launching, still exploring, still asking questions that have no immediate payoff. That endurance is its quiet triumph. NASA did not just launch rockets, it launched a way of thinking, one that treats the universe not as a threat overhead, but as a place humanity belongs. And that may be the most ambitious mission of all.